Wherever you may hail, I'm your host, John Bruni. Welcome to The Focus, where we bring you the most thought-provoking and informative current affairs analysis from around the world. Each episode, we invite top experts and analysts to share their insights on the most pressing issues of our time. From international relations and global economics to science and philosophy, no topic is off limits. Join us as we explore the complex and ever-changing landscape of the world, where we provide valuable perspectives on the events that shape our global community. Today, we are pleased to be joined once again by Dr. Sean McFate, this time speaking about sneaky war and whether it is an antidote to fighting our adversaries with conventional military forces. Sean is an author, strategist, and expert on international relations. He is a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council and a professor at Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service, Syracuse University's Maxwell School, and the National Defense University. He is an advisor to Oxford University's Center for Technology and Global Affairs. Sean is one of the world's leading experts on mercenaries. He is a regular consultant to the Pentagon, the CIA, and Hollywood. But before we start, a shameless plug for ourselves. Please subscribe to our channel. We need the algorithm to find us, and by hitting the subscribe and like buttons, this is your contribution to the growth of what hopefully will become a South Australian global sensation. Sean, thank you for joining us again on The Focus.
Yeah, it's such a great pleasure to be back, John. Thank you.
Look, Sean, at the time of recording, and I will say for our audience, this is the morning of the Thursday, the 24th of August here in Adelaide, I woke up to the news that Wagner Group's Yevgeny Prigozhin was killed in an aircraft accident. Accident, I thought? Perhaps. But as one of the world's leading scholars on mercenary forces, what is your take on this? What will we likely see as a consequence of Prigozhin's demise on the Wagner Group itself?
It looks like Prigozhin's aircraft was blown out of the sky a few hours ago, and there were 10 people on board. It was like a corporate jet, including allegedly Dmitri Utkin, who's the true founder of the Wagner Group. He was the Spetsnaz colonel who retired in 2011 or 12, created it, and then Prigozhin was like the financier of it. And they blew up. I don't think it was an engine malfunction. There's actually a video of this thing twirling down, and all signs point to Putin. But in truth, Prigozhin had many enemies. It's a whodunit, right? And it would be very easy to frame Putin. It could have been the Siloviki, the heads of the internal Russian security apparatus, who despise Prigozhin. It could have been the crafty Ukrainians. We just don't know. But ultimately, I don't think it will matter much, because I think what Putin needs an instrument like Prigozhin to do his dirty work abroad. And he needs the business model that Prigozhin created, but he also wants it without Prigozhin. So I think just assume that Putin did take out Prigozhin, or if he didn't, he still needs something like mercenaries and disinformation to spread Russian hegemony in places like Africa and the Middle East in sneaky ways, which we'll discuss later on, and also ferret back things like gold. Like last year, like almost like $1 million or $1 billion worth of gold from Sudan went quote unquote missing. And that's the gold that's coming out of Moreau mines, that's mined by one of Prigozhin's companies, and it's a way for Prigozhin to fuel, to give money, busting sanctions to fuel the war in Ukraine for Putin. So the truth is that Putin has a symbiotic relationship, not with Prigozhin, but with the business model he created and the instrument he made. He just wanted a new captain at its head, one that was one who's more, I don't have to say, under his thumb, I suppose. So I don't think we'll see much. It could go sideways. We can discuss what that would look like, but I think right now we should expect more of the same.
You could say that becoming the new captain of the Wagner Group could be a poisoned chalice of sorts, because you're up front, you're promoting the Russian state, doing the dirty deeds and all that kind of thing. But again, it sort of seems to come about as that whatever haunted Prigozhin with regard to Russian state sponsorship of the Wagner Group will be something that will haunt the new captain of this mercenary outfit as well. So it'll only be a matter of time before, the rumblings of discontent will start bubbling back up again. And obviously, if you are the new captain of the Wagner Group, you're going to be watching over your shoulder constantly, because I don't think that that's a safe or secure role to take up.
Yeah, it's sort of like being the number 3 of Al Qaeda for many years. We always, but here's where I might disagree, and a lot of this is speculative. Of course, this just happened a few hours ago. The Wagner Group is actually not one, but it's 2 groups. There's an old guard and there's a new guard. Now, the old guard, was created in 2014 by Dmitri Utkin. He went around recruiting sort of high-end Russian-speaking mercenaries, like from former Spetsnaz backgrounds, paratrooper backgrounds, and all like ex-Soviet. Not all of them are Russian passport holders, not at all. And they were pretty high-end, relatively speaking, for the mercenary world. And that's the old guard. Now, the new guard happened in about a year ago, in the summer of 2022, when Putin realized that this war with Ukraine was going to protract. And so he needed bodies, and he didn't want to have he did eventually have a draft, but that was a catastrophe. As hundreds of thousands of Russian men fled. Putin had to figure out, how do I get bodies on the field, but no body bags coming home to St. Petersburg and Moscow and places like that. So what he did is he had conscription from the periphery of the Russian Empire, not from the core, and, Wagner Group. But, Putin said, Prigozhin, get me more bodies. And Prigozhin said, I can't. You have to I have to finally go public with Wagner, and I need to empty out your jails, which is what he did, because they had to go from like 5,000 to 10,000 mercenaries to 50,000 by December of 2022. And so then these convicts, they're the new guard. They're not former career soldiers. They're not real mercenaries. They're just rapists, murderers. And the old guard and new guard hate each other. And the new guard, they were consigned to Eastern Ukraine, sort of the Stalingrad or Verdun of our lifetime. And the old guard stayed in Africa as much as they could to avoid Ukraine and to do Prigozhin's biddings, his business interests, as well as Putin's interests in Africa. And I think that the deal that was struck between Prigozhin and Putin after the march in Moscow, in June, was that, Prigozhin, you leave me your new guard here in Belarus and Ukraine to continue the fight in Ukraine. You get out of this theater, you go down to Africa, you continue doing what I'm asking you to do, and you shut up about Ukraine, you shut up about Garibasov, you just take yourself out of the equation. And so I think that's what happened. And I just think that Putin just, said, enough's enough or whatever. But I think that the old guard, it's still fueling Mali, Sudan. They're all, they're trying to court Niger. I mean, they're still active down there. So I think that, whoever takes over is taking over the old guard in Africa and not taking over Wagner in Ukraine. I think that's owned now wholly by the Ministry of Defense.
All right, well, enough about Mr. Prigozhin. Let's go back to what we were initially trying to set up, our part two on sneaky war. So, Sean, you challenge established wisdom by asserting that high-end conventional military capabilities and even nuclear weapons might not be as decisive in modern warfare as commonly thought. Could you elaborate on how strategies other than open warfare can lead to victory using the analogy of David versus Goliath?
Sure. If we look back to war in the last 70 years, if there's one trend of modern warfare, it's this, is that big battles do not deliver war victory. They do, which is what we're taught in, say, war colleges. We read Clausewitz, we look at World War II, Napoleon, etc. And under that strategic logic, the military was the most important instrument of national power in war, in the political arms of, it's war is essentially, it's armed politics. And it comes down to organized violence. And, nation states battle each other out using their high-tech militaries like gladiators to see who wins. World War II is the best paradigm of that. You have the USS Missouri moment, the capitulation of Berlin, and that settles things. But what we've seen since 1945 is that no longer works. We have big militaries and big countries losing to Luddites. You have, France and Indochina and in Algeria. You have Great Britain and Palestine and Cyprus. You have, the Soviet Union in Afghanistan and the U.S. in Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan. I mean, we all remember in 2003, mission accomplished, right? President Bush, the U.S. had achieved perfect conventional battlefield victory. We wiped out the Iraqi forces, and we expected to be greeted like liberators after World War II, which is what Dick Cheney, the vice president of the day, said. It turns out that there are many ways to win wars, and most of them don't involve a strong military or a military at all. In fact, the last 70 years of warfare, the most winning strategy is not a Clausewitzian or Jominian one. It's a Maoist or Maoist and Sun Tzuian one. And we can discuss what that looks like, but basically it's like strategic jujitsu. You use your opponent's strength against them. You suck them in. You let them take over, have a battlefield victory, but then you suck them into your hinterlands and you bleed them dry until they decide to go home of their own volition. You weaponize time and you weaponize the fact that they are a foreign invader. So I think there's a lot of evidence to show that this idea of more F-35s, Ford-class carriers in the Straits of Taiwan can win great power competition in China is just nonsense, because modern war shows clearly that there's no evidence for this old assumption. It's just generals fighting the last war they won, which was 1945.
Yeah, talking about overly simplifying the modern battle space, we have a habit of wanting to simplify complexity. War is a complex undertaking, but we reserve war for specific activities, and things that may have warlike effects we may tend to push to the side if they don't suit our political agenda. And when you were on with us last, I think the example that you mentioned were the narco wars in Mexico. I mean, this is deemed a policing and criminal matter in spite of some extremely warlike activities between the cartels. Why do you think we like these sort of categorizations? I mean, they are blatantly wrong. Would putting Mexico's narco wars under the military category require a different international response to the violence there? And was this a reason why the US muscularized its policing response by creating the International War on Drugs, rather than simply sending in the special forces to dispatch cartel leaders? And if that were to have happened, would that have made any substantial difference on the ground to Mexico and or other narco states?
It's a great question. I mean, the question really is, what do we privilege as war versus criminality, right? And we all know that Actually, well, just a fefew years ago, maybe in 2017 or 18, a think tank in London, IISS, comes out with their annual, I forget if it's called the conflict survey report, and they found that the number one cause of like combat deaths were in the world where number one was Syria at the time, number two was Mexico, followed by Iraq and Afghanistan. Of course, Mexico City went ballistic. The government of Mexico went ballistic. And I think IISS recanted this and said there was an error with their calculation. I'm not so convinced, but I leave that for others to decide. But the question is clearly, if you look at what's going on in Mexico, it is not mere criminality. And if you look at, wars in sub-Saharan Africa between one ethnic group or another, like the Rwanda genocide. I mean, the Rwanda genocide in 1993 or 4 killed like 900,000 people in 90 days. That is more than all people killed in Iraq and Afghanistan combined over 20 years. Yet we don't view that as a war. We look at it as somehow as a 900,000 person homicide, which is ludicrous. Yeah. And the reasons for this, there are many. I mean, there's some cynical reasons, like, well, if we say it's a war, then we got to commit to it. Also, once you get the military involved, it changes, there's international law. But I also think it's a cultural problem too. And I think we discussed this last time. There's a saying that culture eats strategy for breakfast. Yeah. And in this case, again, our strategic culture can eclipse our strategic IQ. And I think culturally, since we don't see a state involved on the battlefield, we don't view it. If it's a state versus a non-state actor, we view it as a regular war or unconventional war, which is a bizarre terminology. It's a normative term, regular versus irregular. But if we see two non-state actors, we don't even deem it as war. It doesn't even rise to the threshold of war. And I think that is, it's not only naive, it's very dangerous and gets people killed. So I think one of the things I'm trying to promote is that we are critical and creative thinkers to come up with new types of strategy and strategic thinking that can accommodate this. And the question of course, what becomes war, it can't be so broad that everything now is war, but it can't be so narrow that if it's not according to the Geneva Convention, it's not war. We have to find some operational middle ground, and bureaucracies are loath to do so. So there's a lot of, I'm not sure what the fix is beyond a total war and facing annihilation, which we do not want. But we need to broaden our scope.
Yeah, look, and I think that as time goes on, there's always the added complication of potential state breakdown, where within countries, armed militias that are politically motivated arise up and start fighting each other. And that kind of blurs the lines again. I mean, it's not necessarily interstate war, it's intrastate war, where you have a politicized private militia, perhaps, defending one faction against a number of other factions. And, obviously there's also an overlap with regard to when do they then become mercenary outfits themselves, because there is always that evolutionary progression from one state of war to another over time. Okay, well, yeah, that's pretty complex. Actually, look, the other thing that I wanted to pick you up on is the Hearts and Minds. So you've been actually quite critical of Hearts and Minds as a counterinsurgency strategy, calling it naive and ineffective. Could you delve into why you believe this approach falls short and share your insights on more effective strategies for dealing with insurgencies?
Sure. Well, Hearts and Minds is not a new term, although some think David Petraeus invented it. It actually comes from General Templer during the Malaya emergency of the 1950s and arguably before there. But this idea, I think it's one of these ideas that briefs well, but it doesn't execute very well. the idea of, we all know, we're familiar with what Hearts and Minds is trying to do, which it sort of comes from a David Galula strategy. Well, let me go back. Let's say that what American Coin attempted in the war on terrorism years, the 20 years of that, ushered in by General David Petraeus and his Coin crowd, was that what we need to do is use a David Galula-like strategy of winning hearts and minds to recreate a political structure from within, right? And for those who don't know, David Galula was a French, he was a defense attaché, but he spent his entire defense attaché career seeking wars against Maoist revolutionary wars. So he was in the French resistance in World War II. Then he went to Greece, and then he went to Indochina, and then in Algeria, and then when he retired in 1962 or 61, he wrote this book about how to win, counterinsurgency. And that book was the bedrock for American counterinsurgency operations. But the US made a lot of fundamental mistakes. They were like lazy readers of this book. First of all, David Galula was not trying to win hearts and minds or create a sovereign democratic nation of Iraq or Afghanistan. What he was trying to do was reimpose French colonial rule on Indochina, on Algeria, which is wholly the wrong model for creating a sovereign democracy. So he has like this 8 or 9 point plan about how to do this, which include things like, rigging the elections, like, having information warfare, including eliminating political opponents to you that you've already had your people elect. I mean, all in extrajudicial killings. I mean, all of these things that, Petraeus didn't want to do, but you can't, if you're going to do David Galula, you've got to do all of him or none of him. You can't pick and choose. You can't cherry pick the things that you want to do versus the things that you find are, distasteful. Second of all, is that this idea of winning hearts and minds it's a form of what we call ethnic mirroring. So in intelligence analysis, mirror imaging or mirroring is a cardinal sin. It's when you look at another country like North Korea and you're like, well, what would I do if I was in their shoes? And you proceed to assume that everybody in North Korea thinks just like you do, an Australian or an American. And of course they do not. And so big mistakes are made in strategic analysis when people engage in mirroring. And the same thing is true for winning hearts and minds. So this idea of winning hearts and minds is like, if we give them enough security and we give them enough, support, they will give us their hearts and minds. They'll give us their allegiance, right? That's how it works. And you often hear people say that coin is the fight for legitimacy. And that's what they mean. Like if we do better governance by giving them all these things, government services, they will come to our side. They will not listen to the terrorists. They will not give in to the insurgent. That's a strategic logic. But nobody ever stopped to ask, well, what is legitimacy in the mind of this foreign population? And they engaged in ethnic mirroring, thinking that everybody is by their DNA wants to be an American-like democracy. Yeah. And they do not. And so this idea of hearts and minds is based on contract forms of legitimacy like Hobbes and Locke, where a country, like democracy, is a social contract between the rulers and the ruled, and the ruled have to give their consent to the rulers. Hence, they have elections and they have government services that are provided, and that works fine. And if you have a legitimacy model of democracy, but in political Islam, there is no social contract. It's piety to God and Sharia that determines legitimacy, not a government's what services you're providing. What that produced is, think of it this way. Imagine China goes to Adelaide, right? and says, we're gonna, we go to a run. Well, just say they go down to a rundown city in Australia, and they say, look, we will give you free medical care. We will give you free schooling. We're going to rebuild your roads, and we're going to build you a football stadium. And all you've got to do is vote for. We're running this new party in Parliament, and we want you to vote for them. And of course, the party is really us. We don't call it the Chinese Communist Party. We call it, the Australian Socialist Democratic
Liberation
Progressive
Front.
Party. Yeah, something like that, right? And so what happens is, well, Australians will say, fine, we'll take all your stuff, but we're not voting for communists. And that's what happened in Iraq and Afghanistan. It was absolutely foolish of the strategic thinking of Petraeus and everybody else to think that we could bribe our way to political allegiance. You can bribe individuals, but you cannot bribe populations. And that's what we tried to do in Afghanistan and Iraq, and it failed. It failed miserably. So that's why I say hearts and minds is an ineffective way to do counterinsurgency. Counterinsurgency is actually very bloody, brutal, and takes a very long time.
Sean, you coined the term war futurists to describe those who envision future war scenarios that influence present-day strategic decisions. However, history shows that these predictions are often incorrect. How should policymakers and strategists balance the need to anticipate future conflicts with the uncertainty inherent in predicting warfare? We have new disruptive technologies on the market, and they will alter what state and non-state actors can achieve through organized violence, right?
Yeah. Well, it's a great question, too. I mean, so war futurists, again, you always hear this term, generals always fight the last war they won. It's not just generals, it's policymakers, and certainly not all generals. And the U.S. is busy doing this in the streets of Taiwan, or, our military is wargaming the Battle of Midway in the streets of Taiwan as thinking if we can just win a big battle there, we've got great power competition licked. And of course, it's not going to happen that way. In fact, the United States, the West, won the Cold War and avoided large-scale combat operations with the Soviet Union. So why can't China do the same? I think what we need is what I call actually not war futurists, but war artists. And I think what we need is, look, war is strategic thinking is an art. It's not a science. Yeah. A science is, it has a model of epistemology, the scientific model that is has linear complexity, meaning like cause and effect, small inputs equal small outputs. You can, it's like building a 747 where it takes a genius to conceive that and to design it and build it and fly it and maintain it. But ultimately, it can be reverse engineered, right? And you can create a checklist to make new ones. War is not a complicated problem like that. It's a complex one where it's like a family, or it's like Parliament. There's no algorithm that can reverse engineer and predict what Parliament's going to come up with, right? Or how a family is going to decide. Because you have interdependent and independent variables everywhere who all bounce off each other, and you cannot predict that. So rather than trying to model these things on either bad political science theory or too much cleaving to history, like this is how we did in 1945, this is how we're going to do it in 2035. What we need to do is we need to create better strategic thinkers who can think around ambiguity. And I don't have a magic formula for that, but I think it has to do with things like what you learn about in liberal arts and humanities. When you read a novel like Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov, I mean, you can read it to learn about late 19th century Russian society, but that's not really what it's about. It's about learning about themes of love and loss and loyalty and duty and sacrifice, and makes you get into that chaotic, unknowable space, and makes you have to get comfortable with ambiguity and exploiting ambiguity. And if you look at great strategists of the past, like say Bismarck in Germany, what he was really good at was not the master plan, but exploiting strange happenstances. Like Prigozhin got blown out of the plane today. How can Zelensky use that? Right.
Yeah.
So we need critical and creative thinkers. And most military academies, like West Point, they don't do that. They have engineering degrees, which made sense in the 19th century when you had to build bridges across, the desert.
Yeah.
But we need critical thinkers and creative thinkers. And I think in some ways, looking to the humanities opens up spaces, like helps us think that way. Rather than having sort of these master plans and arrows. And anybody who's ever seen like a military PowerPoint show and all the crazy arrows that point everywhere, and it's nuts. So yeah, we need to have more liberal thinking.
Yeah, I get that. And look, honestly, I'm so glad you said this, because my experience also is, much of the three services, the people that get up the food chain are formulaic thinkers, they're scientific thinkers. They pay lip service to the idea of thinking outside the box, but in actual fact, they are part of the box. And so it's easy for them to say, oh, look, we're employing innovative technology innovatively. And really, when you see what they're doing in terms of force structure planning, in terms of, potential responses to, complex and very diverse ranges of threats, they always come back with the same formula, because they can actually add 1 + 1 = 2, rather than what really happens, which is you don't bloody know. And you do need, I love that term, war artist. So would you consider that Clausewitz and Jomini actually were very much in the scientific method, and that's where we draw our military culture from, whereas Sun Tzu and I don't really like the guy, but Mao was more in the artist vein, where they responded creatively to events on the ground, and that gave them, obviously, their sense of, victory on the battlefield.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. I mean, I think Sun Tzu to me is really inspirational. He's not just the fortune cookie of strategy. Yeah. I mean, pick up 20 different translations of Sun Tzu's Art of War, and you get 20 very different books, And to understand Sun Tzu requires a little understanding of ancient Taoist Chinese cosmology, but without going down that road. But you need to, when I say war artist, you have to, like a jazz player, you have to improvise with the tune, improvise with the band, and not be like locked into this is Beethoven's Sixth Symphony, we must play it only this way. And that's what war is. And so how do we develop that? Because we do, I'm sure every military has an incoming group of officers, NCO, troops who think that way, but are driven out before they just get fed up after 5 or 10 years. So we lose them. So how do we identify them? How do we, cultivate them? How do we protect them? One of my favorite books, the movie not so much, as Ender's Game. Maybe some of you, it's a science fiction, by Orson Scott Card, where it's a science fiction, I won't go into the whole thing, but they create like this academy for strategic thinkers for like kids, and they grow them to be strategic thinkers. And we can't do that. But I mean, is there something that we can do? I mean, not me, somebody smarter than me can come up with this, but how do you create that intellectual creative genius who is not going to be a paradigm prisoner? And maybe they're not going to be in uniform. Maybe they come from, they're sculptors, or who knows? I mean, maybe they make crossword puzzles for a living. I mean, we need some type of entrepreneurial thinking out there to help us figure out how do we identify and develop and protect the future great thinkers. Because I think the West, at least the United States, has been more lucky than smart when it comes to winning generals. But we haven't had a winning general since 1945. So what do I know?
See, I look at it from the perspective that militaries around the world, it doesn't matter whether we're talking about Western or, dare I say, Orientalist or Eastern or despotic or whatever. The fact of the matter is that they're all based on hierarchies. a submission to authority, and essentially see the military as a science rather than an art. So they're all
Right.
pretty much wrong, and because they're all mirroring each other with various degrees of local difference. So essentially we're all preparing for the same sort of fight. Yeah.
Yes.
And I think that is something that, you're going to have to break through this cultural divide. And I'm not sure whether or not we have the political will inside our conventional, traditional military structures to do that, because what are you going to do? Flush out all the engineers? Then where are the logisticians going to come from, for instance? You're going to have all these
Yeah.
conflicts within service. So perhaps, and being completely cheeky about this, perhaps we ought to be developing a private military company that can incorporate these things, where there are no fixed sets of expectations of what military force ought to do. You just create it on the fly. You have a piece of paper, map it all out, figure out what your training regime is going to be, and you can then develop your flat structure, your network centric. I mean, we give so much lip service to all of these really cool concepts, but we never mean them. And it's something that I found here in South Australia. We're the Australia's defense industry base, basically, and it's dominated by engineers. And I'm the weirdo because I'm the guy from the humanities and social sciences. And when I start talking to people in the more conventional, straight-laced, they say, "Oh, John, that's great, but
you're right." Well, you know what's really, to your point, look at China. I mean, China is becoming more and more conventional, hierarchical, and it's Mao's army. I mean, the PLA was a guerrilla army, so they've totally drunken the Kool-Aid. Look at the war in Ukraine, where both Ukraine launched. I mean, Russia launched a totally unconventional war in 2014 and won. 2022, they launched a totally conventional war and got stymied by Ukrainian unconventional war, guerrilla units firing anti-tank missiles. And then how is it that by December of that same year, both sides have committed to conventional warfare like Stalingrad or Verdun? And that's where we are today. And the whole counteroffensive, I mean, So this is a larger question. Again, maybe one of your listeners can elucidate us. How is it that, even like America in the 19th century was an unconventional force? And suddenly after 1945, we're all in conventional. Why is it that when the bigger military gets, the more you see these features? Because I think that this is a losing strategy. And I think that we need to power down authority to smaller groups of soldiers, and not so in the United States military, if you're like a special operator in Syria, you've got to get permission basically from the White House to kill something, right? I mean, it's that absurd. How did we get there? But I think, to your point, is we need to break this culture. How you do it without spilling a lot of blood is difficult. And how I learned it, because when I was a paratrooper in the U.S. Army, I was pretty conventional. I mean, and like these generals you talk about, I didn't think that I was that conventional. It wasn't until I became a military contractor globally, not just a guy in Iraq, but like globally, that I became a sort of a conflict entrepreneur. And you're rewarded only by operational success or failure. There's no other there's no turf wars, there's no received wisdom, and you have to be entrepreneurial. And that is where, and you see this in combat armies, where the old leadership dies and they have to come up with, scrappy, plucky leadership, and they win the day sometimes. So this is what we're against. This is what we're up against.
I'm John Bruni, and you're listening to Sage International's The Focus podcast. And from Washington, D.C. in the U.S., we're speaking with author and expert in international relations and mercenary forces, Dr. Sean McFate. Sean, cyber warfare has been gaining significant attention in recent years. You mentioned that it offers new avenues to exploit traditional tactics like sabotage, theft, and espionage. Could you provide examples of how cyber capabilities have been or could be utilized in modern conflicts as you see it? From where
Yeah.
I see it, cyber is like the unloved stepchild of the three military services, Army, Navy, and Air Force. Everyone pays homage to its importance, but few really know how to use it disruptively. Is this
Yeah.
because rather than being an arm of the military services with its own unique culture, it's been allowed to grow organically among and between the traditional fighting services, almost like a sort of connective tissue?
I don't know what cyber is to me. I
Uh,
ask 10 experts and I get 12 answers beyond ones and zeros in space, and
uh,
I'm kind of a cyber skeptic. I don't, somewhere along the line, about 25 years ago, a decision was made or just happened that cyber would be conflated with information,
mm,
right? And that's not fair. I mean, cyber's true power is not in sabotage. It's not like, we're going to make the lights go out. You always hear like some hacker is going to make the lights go out in, Eastern Australia or something like that. And it just never happens. In fact, if we're really looking for blackouts, then, at least in the United States, squirrels are the number one leaders of blackout causers, not cyber hackers. So, which are fluffy little rodent animals. Do you have squirrels in Australia? I don't
no,
know.
we got possums.
No.
They're infinitely
Okay, so
worse. All our animals are
infinitely worse.
infinitely worse.
Yeah, well, yeah, it's true. So, like, but we're not going to make possum warfare. We're not going to make it into a
No.
new form of warfare. And so every time you hear a lot of cyber experts, they talk about speculative things like the lights are going to be shut down,
Mhm.
and they have a lot of jazz hands. Oh, it's all terrible, and 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 you look at like Stuxnet, just over 10 years ago, it didn't stop the Iranian nuclear program. It just slowed it down for a week or two. They just upgraded their software, and all these cyber bugs are one-shot deals. The true power of cyber is that it can harness information. And I think rather than thinking of a cyber war, we have to think about information. So, and this gets back to sneaky war, is that we live in an information age. We have the last 30 years, barring accidental nuclear warfare, we will in the next 30 years. And in an information age, information becomes more important than firepower. And waging information warfare is how you win strategically, not on battlefields. And so, how ways you can do information warfare is, look at China's three warfare strategy. It's like psychological operations, it's media like Russia, Chinese TV, and it's lawfare. And Australia has seen a lot of this
Yep.
in higher education and parliament, and the idea is that you don't try to invade Australia like it's Omaha Beach.
Mm.
What you try to do is you try to use disinformation to turn a society against itself so that they rip their own throats out, so you don't have to. And and that Australia doesn't capitulate like Japan in 45. It just deflates. It goes from like a first world power to a first world country without first world power. It becomes, frankly, a little bit like, say, Italy. I mean, don't tell that to my Italian friends, but it just it doesn't, its geopolitical heft is no longer there. So Australians live a first world life, but they don't have the first world clout that they do right now. That's what victory looks like in the 21st century. And you do it using, sneaky ways like the three warfare strategy of disinformation. And oh, by the way, how does a democracy fight that without becoming an autocracy in the process? Because if you engage in censorship to control it, that's the slow path to autocracy. So it's a win-win for autocracies. And I don't really care about the PLA taking Taiwan. I care about economic warfare, disinformation, sneaky warfare. Things like this, I think, is how the 21st century will be fought, won, or lost.
Arguably, Israel is the only modern developed country that has successfully and consistently used sneaky war or a war of cleverness as its prime method of fighting much larger opponents. but saying that it's used its cleverness by utilizing largely conventional force structures. The Israeli military still has tanks, artillery, and expensive fighter planes in inventory, and it doesn't look like they'll be getting rid of those anytime soon. So does this actually do anything to negate your argument that conventional militaries are irrelevant?
No, it doesn't. Well, first of all, a couple things. One is that I spent when I was writing my book, The New Rules of War, I spent almost 4 months in Israel as a visiting professor in their war college, where I learned firsthand about all this.
Yeah.
And they are doing some very interesting things. Second of all, I don't think we should get rid of our superlative conventional forces. I just think we don't need to buy, in the United States' case, $13 billion aircraft carriers, 5 more of those. We don't need that. We need other things with that money. And we also need different operational concepts. We should fight them a little differently, like, break them down some. I mean, the Marines here in the US have had this very controversial concept called Force Design 2030, where they've taken all the tanks out of the Marine Corps. They've taken out the attack helicopters. They've broken down the way they fight into smaller, more agile groups. They're using things more like missiles rather than big tubed artillery. And of course, the old guard there is like freaking out. Like, how could you get rid of tanks? The truth is, tell me where tanks have made a difference in battle since 1975. I mean, we could talk about Gulf War I in 1990, but operationally, the military, the U.S., the coalition forces achieved their objective, but the plan was not to never leave Iraq, right? So tanks made no difference in Iraq, Vietnam, Afghanistan, many of these places. So I just, the era of the tanks didn't make a difference for the blitzkrieg of Ukraine either. So what Israel has done, I think they've kept their conventional weapons. I don't think they need to. Okay, so some of it has to do with the culture and the politics that you were mentioning, right? So, for example, when I was there, I heard a rumor that the army had developed cheaper long-range missiles, surface-to-surface missiles that were cheap, could fly beyond what an F-15 could fly, and were more, precise, and you didn't risk losing a pilot. But the Air Force shut it down because they didn't want to be out of a job, right? So, and every country has its version of this. But here's what happened for Israel and happened for Iran. Iran learned the path to what's going on now is a long path. Iran, during the 1980s, they struggled for years, almost 10 years in the Iran-Iraq war. And it was a stalemate. And then they saw the U.S. go in there and wipe out everything in a matter of days, right? And so they did what China did in the 1990s and said, well, how can we compete against the United States without a big military? And China came up with unrestricted warfare in 1999. Yeah, that's right. And Iran came up under General Soleimani, who was the IR, he was like the heads of Quds, this new way of fighting sneaky war. And we're going to take on Israel through proxy groups like Hezbollah, through terrorist organizations, through special forces, Quds, and through a lot of slickness and using the Sun Tzuian way of warfare and not Clausewitzian. Yeah. And this, meanwhile, Israel did not evolve. They were this big hierarchical military. And in 2006, some of your listeners might recall that they waged war against Hezbollah in southern Lebanon in July of 2006. And they thought it would be a cakewalk. And they basically got their butts handed to them. And they did it because Hezbollah had been, through all sorts of things, like Hezbollah doing guerrilla warfare, Al-Manar TV station and disinformation and all this modern war stuff. And then for 10 years after that, Israel had been, wringing its hands about how do we get here? When the best military in the Middle East basically loses to an armed, light infantry regiment, what do we do? And so in 2016, they came up with this new concept called the war, like the campaign between wars. It's a sneaky war way to counter Iran's sneaky war in the Levant. in Syria. And they use conventional weapons like F-16s and F-15s, but they use them in non-conventional ways. And I think it's a lesson for all of us. Yeah. Not one for one, but they were their strategic culture was driven to it because of the humiliation of 2006, and because they have this very deep-seated, almost siege mentality in their society that we need to be prepared about being wiped off the face of the earth. Yeah. So Israel is a very interesting case study.
Mm. Okay, final two questions for this one, Sean. Here in Australia, we're limited in what we can do because of the outsized importance we give to our alliance relationship with the United States. In fact, it would not be a stretch to say that strategically we tend to view the world from an American perspective. So if the US doesn't really change tack in terms of how it positions its military forces, we won't develop our own ways and means of defending ourselves unless the Americans lead the way. We'll just continue imitating American strategy and tactics and acquisition patterns as they are currently done. The Australian Defence Force, therefore, sadly, is largely an auxiliary of American conventional forces. I believe that AUKUS is simply pushing us further down this path. If given a chance, how would you try to alter Canberra's thinking about how it defends itself without compromising our relationship with the United States?
Well, there's a couple ways I would do it. I mean, it's what the problem you've articulated is a very serious and grave problem. The United States, but the United States, the military here, there is an intellectual insurgency. And I would try to plug into that and work together and come up with disruptive questions, such as, we love the fact that the Allies won World War II, but we also, won the Cold War. What lessons can we learn from that? Looking at the fact, we won and avoided a large military operation against the Soviets. We won through political warfare, limited economic warfare, sneaky war, offering a better way of life. Let's build on that. I would also ask disruptive questions too, like, why do we, all these war games you're doing with carriers and F-35s and submarines used conventionally, why do you think that delivers victory? Connect those dots, some disruptive questions. Because the U.S. has a really good history now of winning battles but losing wars, right? So, and lastly, come up with a counter theory. And if it's okay, I would like to give you my counter theory about how to win sneaky war, against China. All right. So right now, what we're doing what we're sort of all of us are doing is doing what we call fawn ops, like freedom of navigation, flying airplanes or ships through, the 9-dash line, and there's a lot of saber rattling, and that's fine, but that's necessary, but it's insufficient. If you want to get China out of the South China Sea, out of moving on Taiwan, out of Australian society, we need a different grand strategy. We need to get them focused more on their domestic security, the regime security, than their external security, and they will voluntarily leave us all alone, right? So how do we do that and not have World War III, like nuclear war? Well, let's keep up what we're doing right now with fawn ops, with the ships and the airplanes and saber rattling, and but that just should be a sideshow. Let's use things against them like this. Autocrats hate color revolutions, whether it be in the Maidan Square in Kyiv or Hong Kong. Let's start seeing if we can pop up some of those things, right? Can we covertly, clandestinely, secretly fuel them, or fuel them more? Also, China is fond of telling everybody that they are a millennial civilization, and that they've been, they were the, they're the God's gift to the world, manifest destiny. That's an American thing, but but There are some parallels, I suppose, but the point is that the 21st century will be the Chinese century, but let's also not forget that they are a very old empire, and they are surrounded by peoples and states who hate their guts, like the Vietnamese,
Yep.
like the Japanese, like the Koreans, like the I'm blanking right now, Myanmar, and everybody, India to some extent, right? And Tibet for sure. So and also the stands and stuff. So let's prop up those republics with security force assistance so that they could be a thorn in the side of the panda, so that we don't have to be as much. Again, you're trying to get them to redeploy their security forces away from Taiwan into the internal hinterlands of China to defend their borders. Let's pit Russia and China against each other with a wedge strategy. Let's use disinformation to drive a wedge between the communist regime and the people of China, who are, not always that happy, right? And do you remember like last November when there was like all these anti-COVID riots in cities across China, right? Do we remember like what set that off? So it's kind of for like 3 years there were draconian anti-COVID measures, and they like locked down Shanghai for like 3 weeks. People were on a first date in somebody's apartment and they got locked down in place. I mean, or people like rushing out of, but that part of but the trigger itself was this. The Chinese were watching the World Cup, and they saw like stadiums, I guess in Dubai, 70,000 people standing shoulder to shoulder shouting for hours on end, no masks, no COVID. Right. And that made the Chinese people go WTF.
Yeah.
And that spawned. Why can't we assist that clandestinely?
Right.
Right. Why can we not move that around? We did it during the Cold War, but now we can do it so much better in information age. Or better or best of all. This is something I've been preaching about with Prigozhin and Putin, which has kind of just finally happened. Every autocrat, how autocracies target, democracies with disinformation. And we always lament, democracies are so vulnerable to this type of manipulation, and we can't defend ourselves. We're doomed. Well, it's true that democracies are more vulnerable, but democracies are more resilient. In this new way of war, autocracies are more powerful, but they're more brittle. So let's use their own regime type against them the way they do it against us. They concentrate power, not in a pyramid of power, but like a telephone pole of power. And at the very top is his autocrat with his lieutenants. And the autocrat is always nervous about his life expectancy. He's either going to go out like Castro in Cuba, at an old age, dying in his sleep, or he's going to get shot to death like the guy in Romania at the end of the Cold War. Ceausescu, yeah. Or Saddam Hussein or something like that. So can we not create the impression amongst Xi Jinping or amongst Putin that some of his lieutenants want to stage a palace coup, and he takes out his lieutenants for us and causes disruption? I mean, these are all examples of sneaky warfare, and there's a lot more too. But I think this is, rather than $13 billion carriers, the best weapon we have is 6 inches between our ears. And what are we prepared to live with? Yeah. And, before we kind of sign off, I'll say this. I mean, I don't want to prematurely end it, John, but like, there are going to be listeners who are going to say, oh, well, Australia does not fight that way. This is not what we do. This is not who we are.
That's right.
And, this is dishonorable. But I would say this: is it better somehow to lose honorably than to win dishonorably? And I don't know. For me, the answer is, of course not. But this is the national conversation we should be having, not how many, submarines we might need or whatever. I mean, we need to figure out the concepts and not the platforms.
Look, I totally agree with you, and I think that you're right. There is a problem here inherent with how our political leaderships are fixated on things like weapons, purchasing weapons, ensuring that there is job continuity with regard to, building the next Ford carrier, the next, flight of F-35s, and all of that you have to battle. And these things are systemic and institutionalized in terms of thinking. And as we rightly pointed out earlier, because our defense forces generally are run by engineers, they like toys, and toys justify their existence, and using toys justifies their existence. So actually, I don't know, maybe the plan is that we would have to address the ignorance, and there is a great degree of ignorance among the political classes, so that they understand what's at stake, and that we can then take the remedial actions necessary to put these planks in place where we can have affordable defense, because everyone's struggling right now. The Americans are struggling. Australia, don't even get me started. We're all struggling. Oh my God, where's the money coming from for this and that? And we don't have enough people to man not only our uniformed services, but also the defense industries themselves. So if we are thinking about all of these things and saying to ourselves, there's something wrong with the system, then we need to be able to educate politicians to tell them what's wrong with the system, and then provide them with a kind of solution that will still make them feel comfortable and relaxed moving forward. I don't think we'll ever get perfection out of them, but we can get better responses from them if they're educated.
Well, we share the same problem across the Pacific here. The question is, how do we increase the demand signal for alternative thinking?
Yep.
And the U.S. seems to be perfectly happy to almost bankrupt itself. I mean, the defense budget today is more than Saudi Arabia's GDP, right? And members of Congress still don't think it's high enough, right? I mean, it's absurd. How do we break? And it doesn't help that we have, Hollywood is not our friend here. Movies like Maverick, Top Gun 2, which is a lot of fun, and every fighter pilot will tell you it's the stupidest thing in the world, but still fun to watch. It glorifies World War II like warfare. I mean, you think about it, every year Hollywood produces yet more World War II movies, more than all other wars combined. It's, and it's always like the sappiness. It's like the Band of Brothers or Saving Private Ryan. And I think that this creeps into not just, into the popular imagination about what war is. And getting back to your question of like narco wars in Latin America and these genocides in Africa, nobody looks at that. They just overlook it. They even overlook how we won the Cold War. They go, boom, straight back to the 1940s, which sounds to me ludicrous. But like, this is a mutual, I think, a strategic concern we should all have. Is we have the best military equipment in the world, but not the best military concepts in the world. How do we demonstrate that's lacking?
Yeah, absolutely. Sean, thank you for joining us once again on The Focus and for sharing your insights. It's been an absolutely fascinating discussion, and I wish we had more time.
I know. Thank you, John. You always get me rambling. I don't know how you do it, but I hope you really do. These issues I'm very passionate about them. So I
hear you. I hear you. I'm passionate about them from our side of the ditch. So yeah, absolutely. And thanks to our audience for tuning into the Focus podcast. We hope that you found today's discussion enlightening and thought-provoking. If you have any comments or questions, please feel free to reach out to us on social media. You can find the Focus on Facebook, referenced on the John Bruni and Sage International LinkedIn pages, and on Twitter or on the Sage International website, sageinternational.com.au, by clicking the media drop-down menu and hitting podcasts. Don't forget to subscribe, hit the like button, and or leave us a review on your favorite platform. My thanks to our stalwart production team of Malcolm Hughes and Neil Smart, and to the team at the Ozcast Network. Join us again next time as we continue to delve into the most pressing current affairs issues of our time. Until then, stay informed and stay engaged. I'm John Bruni, and from Adelaide, South Australia, you've been listening to The Focus.